Welcome to Week 3, Lecture, Understanding the Risk Landscape. We shall divide this lecture into two parts. This is Part 1. Slide 1, Understanding the Risk Landscape. Today we are going to discuss something that affects virtually every organization, regardless of whether it is a multinational corporation, a hospital, a university, a government agency, a small family business, or even a nonprofit organization. That subject is risk. When people hear the word risk, they often immediately think about disasters, a fire, an earthquake, a cyber attack, or perhaps a financial crisis. Those are certainly risks, but organizational risk is much broader than that. Risk can come from inside the organization. It can come from outside the organization. It can originate from a supplier, a software company, an employee, a government decision, a competitor, or an event occurring thousands of miles away. The important idea I want you to remember throughout today's lecture is this. Organizations do not operate independently. They operate inside systems of relationships and dependencies. A company may appear financially strong and operationally efficient, but if it relies entirely on one supplier, one cloud provider, one important executive, or one major customer, it may still be extremely vulnerable. Think about your smartphone for a moment. Your phone may work perfectly. The hardware may have no problem at all, but if your cellular provider suffers a nationwide outage, suddenly you cannot call anyone. If a banking application goes offline, you cannot access that service. If a cloud provider experiences a disruption, several applications may stop functioning at the same time. Nothing was necessarily wrong with your phone. The problem existed somewhere else in the ecosystem. Organizations operate in exactly the same way. That is why today's discussion will not simply ask, what could go wrong inside our organization? We will ask a much broader question. What could go wrong anywhere in the ecosystem that could eventually affect us? Throughout the lecture, we will examine internal and external risks, third-party and supplier dependencies, cascading failures, stakeholder relationships, and techniques organizations can use to identify vulnerabilities before those vulnerabilities become crises. By the end of the discussion, I want you to begin looking at risk not as a list of isolated problems, but as a network of interconnected possibilities. Before examining individual risks, let us first look at the roadmap for today's discussion. Slide 2, today's agenda. Our discussion is organized into four major areas. The first area is the risk landscape. Here we will distinguish between internal risks and external risks. We will also examine what we call the macro to local threat continuum. In other words, we will look at risk from the largest possible level, such as geopolitical conflicts, global pandemics, or worldwide economic disruptions, and follow those effects downward until they reach an individual organization, facility, department, or employee. The second area is third-party and supplier risk. Modern organizations outsource enormous portions of their operations. A company may outsource payroll. It may outsource cybersecurity. It may store information using a cloud provider. It may purchase components from overseas manufacturers. It may use consultants, logistics providers, staffing companies, accounting firms, or software platforms. Every time an organization becomes dependent on another organization, it acquires some portion of that organization's risk. That does not mean outsourcing is bad. Outsourcing can improve efficiency tremendously, but management must understand that outsourcing an activity does not necessarily mean outsourcing the consequences if something goes wrong. The third part of today's lecture concerns stakeholder interdependence. We will look beyond vendors and suppliers and examine the broader stakeholder ecosystem. Customers, employees, regulators, governments, investors, communities, technology providers, and business partners. The key word here is interdependence. Interdependence means that the actions or conditions of one stakeholder can influence the others. Finally, we will move from theory into application through a risk identification workshop and case discussion. The goal is not simply to memorize terminology. The goal is to develop the ability to look at an organization and ask, what are we dependent upon? What could interrupt those dependencies? How serious would that interruption be? How quickly could we replace the affected resource? Who should be responsible for preparing for that possibility? Think of today's lecture as learning how to perform an organizational health examination. A physician does not only examine the place where the patient says it hurts. The physician considers the entire system because one problem may be connected to another. Risk managers must think the same way. Class discussion prompt. Before continuing, ask yourself, if your organization suddenly stopped operating tomorrow morning, what are the three things most likely to have caused the disruption? Keep those possibilities in mind as we continue. Our first step is distinguishing risks that originate inside the organization from those that originate outside it. Slide 3, internal versus external risks. One of the most fundamental distinctions in enterprise risk management is the difference between internal risk and external risk. And internal risk originates primarily from conditions, decisions, processes, people, or systems within the organization. An external risk originates primarily outside the organization's direct control. Let us begin with internal risks. Operational failures and process breakdowns. Suppose a hospital has excellent doctors and nurses, but its medication ordering process is poorly designed. If the system allows medications to be incorrectly labeled or delivered to the wrong department, that becomes an operational risk. The source of the problem is internal, the organization's process. Another example would be an airline whose aircraft are perfectly functional, but whose scheduling system incorrectly assigns flight crews. Flights could be delayed or canceled even though nothing is mechanically wrong with the airplanes. Talent gaps and leadership transitions. Organizations also depend heavily on people. Imagine a small company where only one employee knows how to operate a critical accounting system. If that employee resigns tomorrow and nobody else has been trained, the company has what we might call key person dependency. Similarly, leadership transitions can introduce uncertainty. When a CEO suddenly resigns, employees, customers, investors, suppliers, and competitors may react differently. Leadership risk is therefore not limited to whether a manager performs well. It also includes succession planning and organizational continuity. Technology debt and system vulnerabilities. Technology debt occurs when organizations continue using outdated systems because replacing them appears expensive or inconvenient. For several years, the system may continue operating. Management may therefore conclude, why replace it? Nothing has happened. But the absence of a failure does not mean the absence of risk. Eventually, the old system may no longer receive security updates, may become incompatible with newer software, or may become difficult to repair. Financial mismanagement or fraud. Internal financial risk can involve poor budgeting, inaccurate financial reporting, excessive borrowing, weak financial controls, theft, or fraud. For example, if the same employee can approve a payment, issue the payment, and reconcile the bank account, the organization has created an internal control weakness. Governance and compliance failures. Governance risk concerns how decisions are made, monitored, and controlled. If senior managers ignore compliance requirements or employees are afraid to report wrongdoing, risk increases. Now let us contrast these with external risks. Market volatility. A company may operate efficiently but still face declining demand. For example, changing consumer preferences can destroy the market for a product even when the company's internal operations remain excellent. Regulatory and geopolitical change, governments can impose sanctions, tariffs, new labor regulations, environmental requirements, or reporting rules. An organization may have no control over those decisions, but it still has to respond to them. Natural disasters and climate events, earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, extreme heat, and other disasters can affect facilities, workers, transportation, Utilities and suppliers. Cyber attacks, cyber risk is particularly interesting because it can cross the internal external boundary. The attacker may be external, but an internal weakness, such as an employee clicking a phishing link, may allow the attack to succeed. This illustrates an important principle. Internal and external risks frequently interact. For example, a hurricane is external. But if an organization never developed a disaster recovery plan, the resulting operational failure also reflects an internal weakness. So effective risk management should not simply ask, was the event internal or external? We should also ask, what internal conditions made us more or less vulnerable to the external event? Real life example, COVID-19. COVID-19 is an excellent illustration. The pandemic itself was external to individual companies, but organizations experienced dramatically different consequences depending on their internal preparedness. Companies with remote work capabilities, cloud-based systems, emergency plans, diversified suppliers, and strong cash reserves generally had more options than companies lacking those capabilities. The external threat was similar. The organizational vulnerability was different. That distinction is central to resilience management. Now that we understand where risk originates, we need to examine another dimension, the scale at which risk operates. Slide 4. The threat continuum. Macro to local risk exists at multiple levels simultaneously. We can think of these levels as a continuum running from macro-level threats to local or micro-level consequences. A macro-level threat affects a large system. Examples include global economic recessions, international conflicts, pandemics, global commodity shortages, major technological disruptions, international trade restrictions. At the opposite end are local risks. These might involve one warehouse, one supplier, one employee, one computer system, one production line, one customer account. The mistake organizations sometimes make is treating these levels separately. In reality, they are connected. Example, semiconductor shortage. Consider the global semiconductor shortage that affected industries during and after the COVID-19 disruptions. At the macro level, there were global supply constraints. At the industry level, automobile and electronics manufacturers competed for limited semiconductor supplies. At the corporate level, companies had difficulty maintaining production schedules. At the plant level, manufacturing lines sometimes had insufficient components. At the customer level, consumers experienced shortages, delays, or higher prices. Notice the progression. Global disruption to industry pressure to company disruption to local operational problem to customer consequence. This is why risk managers cannot focus only on what is happening directly outside the office building. An event on another continent may eventually affect your inventory. Example, Suez Canal blockage. Another useful example is the 2021 blockage of the Suez Canal. One ship became stuck. At first glance, that sounds like a highly localized transportation problem, but the Suez Canal is an important global shipping route. When transportation through that route was interrupted, ships were delayed, transportation schedules changed, supply chains were affected, and companies thousands of miles away potentially faced delayed inventory. That is a perfect illustration of how a local event can produce macro consequences. The opposite can also occur. COVID-19 was a global event that eventually affected individual restaurants, schools, factories, hospitals, and families. The management lesson risk professionals must therefore constantly ask two questions. First, what large-scale developments could eventually reach us? Second, could a small failure somewhere in our own network grow into something much larger? This is sometimes described as examining first-order, second-order, and third-order effects. A first-order effect is the immediate consequence. A second-order effect is what happens because of the first consequence. A third-order effect is what happens afterward. Suppose a factory loses electricity. First-order effect, production stops. Second-order effect, customer orders are delayed. Third-order effect, customers move to competitors. Fourth order effect, revenue decreases. Fifth order effect, employees' working hours are reduced. One event can therefore generate an entire chain of consequences. Teaching analogy. Think about dropping a stone into water. The stone touches only one small point, but the ripples travel outward. Risk behaves similarly. Sometimes the original event is relatively small. What matters is how far the ripple travels. One of the most important places where those hidden ripples originate is outside the organization in its suppliers, vendors, and other third parties. Slide 5. Third-party supplier and vendor risk. Third-party risk has become one of the most important issues in modern enterprise resilience because organizations increasingly depend on outside companies to perform essential functions. Every organization has what we might call a dependency network. Let us break this network into categories. Tier 1. Suppliers. Tier 1. Suppliers are companies with which your organization directly conducts business. Suppose you operate a restaurant. Your food distributor is a Tier 1 supplier. Your payment processing provider is another. Your cleaning company may be another. These relationships are relatively visible because you have direct contracts with these companies. But visibility creates a dangerous assumption. Organizations sometimes think, we know our supplier, therefore we understand the risk. Not necessarily. Your supplier may depend on several other companies that you know nothing about, Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers. Suppose your restaurant buys chicken from distributor A. Distributor A obtains chicken from processor B. Processor B depends on several farms. You may have no direct relationship with processor B or the farms. Yet if one of those upstream entities suffers a major disruption, eventually you may be unable to obtain chicken. You are exposed to organizations that you may never have contracted with directly. This is sometimes called nth party risk, risk beyond the direct third party. Technology vendors. Technology vendors present another major exposure. Many organizations depend on cloud computing, payroll software, email systems, customer relationship management platforms, cybersecurity providers, online payment systems, data storage services. The important concept here is concentration risk. Suppose 10 important business processes all depend on the same cloud infrastructure. Management may initially think it has 10 separate systems, but from a risk perspective, it may actually have one dependency. If the common provider fails, all 10 systems could be affected simultaneously. Professional services. Professional services organizations can also create risk. Think about lawyers, auditors, consultants, staffing agencies, accountants, public relations firms. These organizations may have access to highly sensitive information. A cybersecurity breach at a law firm, for example, could potentially expose information belonging to the firm's corporate clients. Real-life example, target data breach. A well-known historical example of third-party exposure involved the 2013 Target data breach. Attackers reportedly gained access using credentials associated with a third-party HVAC contractor. The lesson is powerful. A company might spend millions protecting its own network, yet a weaker outside partner can still become an entry point. This gives us one of the most important rules in third-party risk management. Your security and resilience can sometimes be limited by the weakest organization connected to you. Supplier due diligence. Therefore, when evaluating suppliers, organizations should ask questions such as, what happens if this vendor becomes unavailable? How quickly can we replace it? Does the vendor have its own disaster recovery plan? Where does the vendor store our information? Who are the vendor's critical suppliers? Is our organization one of many customers competing for limited resources during a crisis? Are we overly dependent on one provider? Selecting a vendor should therefore involve more than comparing price. A vendor may be cheap precisely because it has weak backup systems, limited insurance, no alternative facilities, or insufficient security. The least expensive supplier can sometimes become the most expensive supplier after a disruption. Simple analogy. Imagine buying the cheapest umbrella available. If it breaks the first time it rains heavily, the purchase price was low, but the reliability was also low. Third-party management involves evaluating not simply cost, but dependability under pressure. The danger becomes even greater when one supplier failure does not remain isolated but begins spreading throughout the network. Slide 6, Cascading Risk, How Failures Propagate. This slide introduces one of the most important concepts in modern resilience management, cascading risk. Cascading risk occurs when one failure triggers another failure, which triggers another, producing a sequence of disruptions. The slide illustrates a simple progression: vendor outage to operational disruption to revenue and SLA impact. Let us expand that. Imagine an online retailer whose payment processor goes offline. The payment processor is the original failure. Customers then cannot complete purchases. That becomes an operational disruption. Orders decline, revenue declines, customers complain, customer service volume increases. Some customers purchase from competitors. The company's reputation may suffer. If the company has promised particular service levels to business customers, it may also violate contractual obligations. What began as a technology problem becomes an operations problem, a sales problem, a customer service problem, a contractual problem, a financial problem, and potentially a reputational problem. That is a cascade. Real life example: CrowdStrike IT disruption. The July 2024 CrowdStrike-related global IT disruption is a useful illustration of how technology dependencies can produce cascading effects. A defective software update affected Windows systems across many organizations. The immediate technical problem was related to computers, but the effects extended well beyond IT departments. Airlines experienced operational disruptions, hospitals and other organizations encountered system problems, businesses faced interruptions. The lesson is that organizations may think of cybersecurity or IT as a technology issue, but once technology becomes embedded in operations, an IT failure becomes an enterprise risk. Cascades can move quickly. Speed is important. Traditional organizational crises sometimes developed slowly. Modern digital systems operate almost instantaneously. A software update can be distributed to thousands or millions of devices quickly. A misleading social media story can spread globally within minutes. An automated financial trading system can react in fractions of a second. Therefore, organizations need predefined escalation procedures. During a crisis is not the ideal time to decide who should we call. Those decisions should already be documented. Scenario planning. Scenario planning is one defense. Suppose your organization uses Microsoft Teams for communication. Ask, what happens if Teams is unavailable for 24 hours? Perhaps employees switch to email. Then ask, what happens if Teams and email are unavailable? Perhaps managers use emergency messaging systems. Then ask, what happens if internet access in the building also disappears? Now you are beginning to think about deeper resilience. Good scenario planning keeps asking, and then what? Example of a supply chain cascade. Imagine a car manufacturer. A small supplier produces a specialized electronic sensor. The sensor represents only a tiny percentage of the total cost of the vehicle. However, without the sensor, the vehicle cannot be completed. Supplier shuts down. Sensor deliveries stop. Assembly slows. Vehicles remain unfinished. Dealer inventory decreases. Customers wait longer. Revenue is delayed. Competitors gain sales. Employees may work fewer shifts. One inexpensive component has now produced a multi-million-dollar disruption. This teaches us an important distinction. The financial value of an input is not necessarily equal to its operational criticality. Something inexpensive can still be absolutely essential. Question for students. Consider your own organization. What is one seemingly small resource that, if unavailable for 3 days, could create a surprisingly large disruption? That question often reveals risks traditional financial analysis misses. Once we understand cascading failures, the next step is recognizing that resilience depends not only on systems and suppliers, but on relationships among stakeholders.